nobody asked me if I wanted to exist. Yeah, one day, boom.
Ah, I see. This is the podium. Could we get me a chair, please, that I can sit on while the video?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh. Yeah, I know.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to Camford, those of you who have come to join us today, and obviously to our own students and staff as well. We are immensely privileged today to have William Lane Craig with us. I'm actually going to hand over now to Mr. Sam Leeper, who's going to do a rather more sort of fulsome introduction for the very exciting things to come. And thank you so much for coming. Okay, Sam, come on in.
Thank you, Headmaster. Good morning and welcome to Camford School, and to those also who are watching on the live feeds. My name is Sam Leeper, and I'm Head of Philosophy and Theology here at Camford. It is great to see so many young people here who are interested in the big questions. The discussion of whether God exists is perhaps the biggest of them all. My challenge for you today is to think carefully, critically, about what you hear. Considering and acknowledging all points of view in an academically rigorous way, whatever your belief system, is extremely important in humanity's quest for the truth and for knowledge. It's an absolute honour to welcome our special guest this morning. Dr. William Lane Craig is a research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology and a professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University. He studied undergraduate level at Wheaton College and graduate studies at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. In 1975, he pursued his doctoral studies here in England at the University of Birmingham, under the supervision of John Hick, whose work is covered by most philosophy and theology exam boards in the UK. In 1978, he pursued a second doctorate, this one in theology, at the University of Munich. He has authored over 30 books, including my personal favourite, The Kalam Cosmological Argument, Reasonable Faith, and On God, Defending Your Faith with Reason and Precision, just to name a few. Dr. Craig has debated public figures such as the late Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and A.C. Grayling, who was on this very stage not too long ago here at Camford. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Dr. William Lane Craig.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm currently embarked on a lecture tour of English schools. And this is rather unusual for me. On previous lecture trips to the UK, I've always spoken on university campuses. But this time, I've had the opportunity to speak to audiences at several of England's finest schools, including Canford. Indeed, this is the last stop on our tour, and I'm looking forward to our discussion this morning. This morning, I want to share with you, briefly, 3 reasons to think that God exists and why it makes a difference. Now, in order to make these arguments accessible to everyone, I've put them into the form of short animated videos, which I'll be sharing as part of my presentation this morning. These are also available on our website, reasonablefaith.org. Let me start with why it makes a big difference whether God exists. Far from being a matter of indifference, I think that the question of God's existence is the most important question that a human being can ask. People who shrug their shoulders and say, "What difference does it make whether God exists?" show that they merely have not thought very deeply about this question. Even atheist philosophers, such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell, and Jean-Paul Sartre, who have thought deeply about these questions, admit that the existence of God makes a tremendous difference for mankind. These philosophers have argued that if God does not exist, then human life is ultimately absurd. The absurdity of life involves 3 elements: meaning, value, and purpose. These 3 notions, meaning, value, purpose, though closely related, are conceptually distinct. Meaning has to do with something's importance, why it matters. Value has to do with the thing's moral worth, its being good or evil, right or wrong. Purpose has to do with a goal, a reason for something. If there is no God, then according to these atheist thinkers, life is ultimately without meaning, value, or purpose. Our first video this morning helps to explain the human predicament in the absence of God.
You know, nobody asked me if I wanted to exist. Yeah, one day, boom, there you are. And you think to yourself, why am I here? Well, what do you think? Is there a reason we're here? Do our lives have any real significance?
Well, that depends
On what?
on whether or not God exists.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying that my life has no significance because I don't believe in God?
No, not at all. I'm saying that if God doesn't exist, it doesn't matter what you believe. Our lives would have no objective meaning, value, or purpose. Many atheists themselves recognize this. If atheism is true, life is absurd.
Okay, and why do they think that?
To begin with, if God does not exist, then the physical universe is all there is. Which means you and I are just accidental byproducts of nature.
Right, so?
That means we were not intentionally designed, so there's no purpose for us being here.
Whoa.
It gets worse. If God does not exist, there is no absolute standard of moral value. You heard of Richard Dawkins, the atheist. He points out that in a materialistic universe, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference.
So, you're saying atheists can't be good people?
No, I'm not saying that. Many atheists live good lives. What I'm saying is, atheism fails to provide an objective basis for saying any particular action is good or evil.
Oh, come on. After millions of years of sociobiological evolution, humans have developed a sense of morality. We all know it's good to feed a hungry child and bad to torture someone for fun.
Of course we do, but that's precisely what atheism cannot explain. If there's no God, then what we consider right or wrong is nothing more than an accident of evolution or a human social convention.
So what? I'm good with that.
Really, evolution implies survival of the fittest, not morality. And social convention means that racism, intolerance, and cruelty are not really wrong. They just happen to be unpopular.
Okay, so atheists need to come up with some objective standard for rights and wrongs. How about this? If an action leads to human flourishing, then we can say it's objectively good. And if it doesn't, it's objectively evil.
But why think that human flourishing is good? Aren't you being species-centric? Why not refer instead to the flourishing of rats or cabbages?
Well,
And who gets to decide what contributes to human flourishing? Hitler was convinced killing millions of Jews would promote human flourishing. And Margaret Sanger thought forcing poor people to be sterilized would lead to human flourishing. As Carl Nielsen points out, pure practical reason will not take you to morality. So if atheism is true, there is no legitimate basis for saying that behaving one way is worse than behaving any other way. So it really doesn't matter how you live your life. Your day-to-day choices are meaningless.
that's depressing.
So if there's no God, what happens when you die?
Well, nothing. You simply cease to exist.
Right. So one person lives a kind, generous, thoughtful life. Another lives a horrible, violent, selfish life. It doesn't matter. In both cases, the outcome is the same. Nothingness. So how can their life choices have any objective meaning?
Well, it's certainly meaningful if I discover a cure for cancer or save a child's life.
I agree completely. But atheism can't explain why. Scientists predict that eventually the whole universe and mankind with it will die out. So everything comes to nothing. That's why atheist Bertrand Russell says we must build our lives on the firm foundation of despair.
No thanks. I'd rather live a happy life.
You're not alone. Every atheist has to choose between being happy or being consistent. You can tell the whole world you're an atheist, but you can't really live like one.
Okay, so you're a Christian. If your God did exist, how would that change anything?
If Christianity is true, then each one of us is here for a reason. And life does not end at the grave. And God, He's the absolute standard of goodness. He knows you, He loves you, and He intentionally created you. So your life ultimately does have objective meaning, value, and purpose. That means you can live a life that's both happy and consistent.
Well, that doesn't prove Christianity is true.
Agreed. I'm simply pointing out that for Christians, living a life that is both happy and consistent is possible. For atheists, it's not. So what are you going to choose?
Given the absurdity of life and the unlivability of atheism, it's imperative, I think, that we retrace our steps and ask anew whether or not God exists. As a professional philosopher, I believe that the hypothesis that God exists makes sense of a wide range of the data of human experience. And today I want to share with you 3 reasons why I think that God does indeed exist. Number 1, God makes sense of the origin of the universe. Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Typically, atheists have said that the universe is just eternal, and that's all. But is that plausible? The next video explains how the scientific evidence for the origin of the universe points beyond the universe to its ground in a transcendent creator.
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is, or ever was, or ever will be? One approach to answering this question is a cosmological argument. It goes like this: whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician. And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin? Or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy, and that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedman and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the redshift and light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension. However, not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into existence. But one by one, these models failed to stand the test of time. More recently, 3 leading cosmologists, Arvin Bohr, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin prove that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true. This means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful, much like God. The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist.
Here once more are the simple premises of this argument. 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. One of the most startling developments of modern science is that we now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning about 14 billion years ago in a cataclysmic event known as the Big Bang. As explained in the video, in 2003, Arvin Bohr, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to prove that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past, but must reach a past space-time beginning. And the same goes for multiverse scenarios as well. In 2012, Vilenkin showed that models which do not meet this one condition still fail for other reasons to avert the beginning of the universe. Vilenkin concluded, and I quote, "None of these scenarios can actually be past eternal. All the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning," end quote. In the fall of 2015, Vilenkin strengthened that conclusion. He wrote, "We have no viable models of an eternal universe. The Bohr-Guth-Vilenkin theorem gives reason to believe that such models simply cannot be constructed." The Bohr-Guth-Vilenkin theorem proves that classical spacetime, under a single, very general condition, cannot be extended to past infinity, but must reach a boundary at some time in the finite past. Now, either there was something on the other side of that boundary or not. If not, then that boundary just is the beginning of the universe. If there was something on the other side, then it will be a region described by the yet-to-be-discovered theory of quantum gravity. In that case, Vilenkin says, it will be the beginning of the universe. Either way, the universe began to exist. Since something cannot come into being out of nothing, the absolute beginning of the universe implies the existence of a beginningless, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, changeless, immaterial, enormously powerful creator of the universe. Number 2, God makes sense of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. In recent decades, scientists have been stunned by the discovery that the existence of intelligent life, like ours, depends upon a complex and delicate balance of initial conditions simply given in the Big Bang itself. Scientists once believed that whatever the initial conditions of the universe might have been, eventually intelligent life might evolve somewhere. But we now know that our existence is balanced on a razor's edge. The existence of intelligent life anywhere in the cosmos depends upon a conspiracy of initial conditions which must be fine-tuned to a degree that is literally incomprehensible and incalculable. The following video explains how this remarkable fine-tuning points to a personal designer of the universe.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly, or too slowly. In either case, the universe would again be life-prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely. What is the best explanation for this astounding phenomenon? There are 3 live options. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Which of these options is the most plausible? According to this alternative, the universe must be life-permitting. The precise values of these constants and quantities could not be otherwise. But is this plausible? Is a life-prohibiting universe impossible? Far from it. It's not only possible, it's far more likely than a life-permitting universe. The constants and quantities are not determined by the laws of nature. There's no reason or evidence to suggest that fine-tuning is necessary. How about chance? Did we just get really, 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 really lucky? No. The probabilities involved are so ridiculously remote as to put the fine-tuning well beyond the reach of chance. So, in an effort to keep this option alive, some have gone beyond empirical science and opted for a more speculative approach, known as the multiverse. They imagine a universe generator that cranks out such a vast number of universes that, odds are, life-permitting universes will eventually pop out. However, there's no scientific evidence for the existence of this multiverse. It cannot be detected, observed, measured, or proved. And the universe generator itself would require an enormous amount of fine-tuning. Furthermore, small patches of order are far more probable than big ones. So the most probable observable universe would be a small one, inhabited by a single, simple observer. But what we actually observe is the very thing that we should least expect: a vast, spectacularly complex, highly ordered universe, inhabited by billions of other observers. So even if the multiverse existed, which is a moot point, it wouldn't do anything to explain the fine-tuning. Given the implausibility of physical necessity or chance, the best explanation for why the universe is fine-tuned for life may very well be it was designed that way. A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge.
The examples of fine-tuning in the video are all up-to-date, accurate, and well-established. The question we face then is, what is the best explanation for the cosmic fine-tuning? There are three live options in the contemporary literature on fine-tuning: physical necessity, chance, or design. So, our argument may be formulated in three simple steps. 1. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. 2. It is not due to physical necessity or chance. 3. Therefore, it is due to design. As the video explains, the only serious alternative to the design hypothesis is the multiverse chance hypothesis. There are multiple problems with this hypothesis, but let me highlight just one of the most important. If our universe were just a random member of a multiverse, then we ought to be observing a much different universe than we do. Roger Penrose of Oxford University has pressed this objection forcefully. He points out that the odds of our universe's initial low entropy conditions existing by chance alone are on the order of 1 chance out of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. By contrast, the odds of our solar systems suddenly forming by the random collision of particles is 1 chance out of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 60. This number, says Penrose, is utter chicken feed compared to 10 to the 10 to the 123rd. What that means is that it is far more likely that we should be observing a patch of order no larger than our solar system, since a universe like that is so unfathomably more probable than a fine-tuned universe like ours. In fact, the most probable observable universe is one which consists of a single brain which pops into existence by a random fluctuation with illusory perceptions of the external world. So, if you accept the multiverse explanation of fine-tuning, you're obligated to believe that you are all that exists, and that your body, this auditorium, the earth, everything you perceive in the world is just an illusion of your brain. No sane person believes such a thing. On atheism, then, It is highly improbable that there exists a randomly ordered multiverse. With the failure of the multiverse hypothesis, the alternative of chance collapses. Neither physical necessity nor chance provides a good explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe. It follows logically that the best explanation is design. Number 3, God makes sense of objective moral values and duties in the world. The following video makes this argument very clear.
Can you be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So, in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed his moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in his command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem. Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? The answer is neither one. Rather, God wills something because he is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording. The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice, You affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals. We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination and terrorism are wrong, for everybody, always. Is this just personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. What all this amounts to then is a moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, the existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
Again, this argument can be very simply formulated. 1. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist. 3. Therefore, God exists. Perhaps the most important thing to keep in mind about the moral argument is not to confuse moral ontology with moral epistemology. Now, what do I mean by that? Moral ontology has to do with the objective reality of moral values and duties. Moral epistemology has to do with how we come to know moral values and duties. The moral argument has nothing to say about moral epistemology. It makes no claim about how we come to know objective moral values and duties. The argument is wholly about moral ontology, the grounding of objective moral values and duties in reality. So, epistemological objections about how we come by our moral beliefs are irrelevant to the argument. From the two premises, it follows logically that God exists. The moral argument complements the cosmological and design arguments by telling us something about the moral nature of the creator and designer of the universe. It gives us a personal, necessarily existent being who is not only perfectly good, but whose very nature is the standard of goodness and whose commands constitute our moral duties. There are many other arguments for God's existence which we don't have time to discuss this morning. But on our website, reasonablefaith.org, we also have videos on some of these as well, which I invite you to look at. The arguments presented here this morning constitute, I think, a powerful cumulative case for the existence of God. Together, they yield a metaphysically necessary, uncaused, transcendent, immaterial, personal creator and designer of the universe who is the paradigm and source of objective moral goodness. And that not only makes a huge difference for mankind, but it can also make a personal, life-changing difference for you as well. Yes, could you call on the questioners? And if I have difficulty understanding them, I'll ask you to help interpret.
So we've got microphones as well. Does anybody have any questions?
So in one of the videos you mentioned, the last one there, you mentioned that God has like perfectly good morals and everything that he says is either good or bad and everyone should follow him. But in a few occasions that God's morals seem to be somewhat strange because he ordered the genocide of a lot of people in Canaan, and you even said that God said that all the children should be like murder them, that loads of people in Canaan should be executed as well, and you tell them the matter that the children's death was also their salvation. So it seems in a few examples that God's morals conflict with what we now see as our morals today. Mm-hmm. So what do you think of this matter here?
Well, in the first place, I'm not defending biblical inerrancy. If you find those stories in the Old Testament to be historically incredible, you're at liberty to regard them either as legends or as the disobedience of Israel to the commands and the goodness of God. The stories are simply irrelevant to the moral argument. Just think about it. Which premise of the moral argument would these stories call into question? Does it call into question the first premise, that if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist? No, it does nothing to call into question that premise. What about the second premise, that objective moral values and duties do exist? Well, it doesn't call that into question either. In fact, it presupposes the truth of that by saying that God here has commanded Israel to do something that is immoral, that is objectively wrong. So it actually presupposes that premise. So when you think about it, this objection based on these Old Testament stories just is irrelevant to the moral argument. So what is it relevant to? What does this objection prove? Well, I think at most it would disprove a doctrine of biblical inerrancy, that the Bible is entirely accurate in recording God's commands to kill the Canaanite tribes. And that's an in-house issue among Christians. That's not an issue that separates theists and atheists. That's a debate among people who are already biblical believers, the degree to which they think that biblical inerrancy is true. And I think that's important to understand, because you can then see that the objection really doesn't have the teeth that one might think at first that it does have. But how might one address the objection itself? On our website, in Question of the Week number 16, I address this question. It is a mischaracterization of God's command to call this genocide. It is not a command to commit genocide. The command by God is to drive the Canaanite tribes out of the land of Canaan and to deliver the land to Israel. The Canaanite tribes were under the judgment of God for their incredible evil. God had allowed Israel to languish for 400 years in Egypt before giving the land of Canaan to them. And why? Well, God says to Abraham, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. They were not fully ripe for judgment. And so God waited 400 years until this culture, these peoples, were so morally degenerate that now they fell under the just judgment of God for their wickedness. Just as hundreds of years later, God would use the armies of Babylon to judge Israel itself, his own people, when it fell into wickedness. So God was destroying these Canaanite states as nations. It wasn't a command to hunt down all of these Canaanites and kill them. No such command was ever carried out. Rather, they were being destroyed as national or political entities. They were being divested of the land and driven out. Had none of them chosen to fight, had they simply retreated in the advance of the Israeli armies, no one needed to be killed. The judgment was to divest them of the land, and it is the land that is so important, all important to these Middle Eastern peoples. It is the land that is the blessing of God. And now the land of Canaan was being given to Israel, and these Canaanite tribes were being divested of it. And so I think that God's judgment upon these Canaanite nations was entirely just. And I've argued that in doing this, he wronged no one. He did not wrong the Canaanites. He did not wrong the Israelites. That this was fully compatible with his love and justice. So I don't see any reason to think that this narrative is an example of God's issuing an immoral command or something that is morally contrary to our intuitions.
Just down here.
How would you respond to the criticism of the design argument that, yes, maybe design suggests a designer, but that the design is flawed with the existence of evil and suffering, both in natural evil and moral evil? So how does that suggest a benevolent and omnipotent God?
So the question concerns the existence of natural evil in the world and how this could be permitted by an all-powerful and all-loving God. I would say that God's overriding purpose for humanity is to bring as many people into a free, eternal love relationship with himself. And I think that it is not at all implausible that only in a world suffused with natural and moral evil would the optimal number of people freely come to know God and his love. The atheist who wants to press the problem of evil and suffering would have to show that it's possible for God to create a world involving less natural and moral evil in which an optimal number of people come freely to experience and find that love relationship with God. And how could the atheist possibly prove such a thing? It's pure speculation. So it seems to me quite plausible that God has so providentially ordered the world that in a world that is filled with natural and moral evil, the optimal number of people will freely come to know him and find salvation. Is this just some airy-fairy speculation on my part? Well, in fact, it's not. When you look at the demographics of the world and see the areas where Christianity in particular is growing at its fastest rates, you will find that this is in areas of the world that have experienced tremendous natural evil as well as moral evil. Places like Ethiopia and the Sudan, China, Ecuador, Philippines, and so forth. The places where the growth rates of Christianity are flat are in the indulgent, comfortable West. So, in fact, the luxury and easy lifestyle that we enjoy in the West has been, it seems, a positive impediment to people's coming into a free love relationship with God. One person I spoke to about this said, it might be that our prosperity and comfort in the West is actually the judgment of God upon us, paradoxically, for our indifference to him. So it is not, I think, just a groundless speculation. It's not at all implausible that God would use natural and moral suffering as a means through which he draws people freely to a love relationship with himself.
Have you ever doubted your faith in God? And if so, what made you doubt it?
I didn't understand.
Have you ever doubted your faith in God? And if so,
Oh, certainly. I am not claiming that these make God's existence certain. I'm saying they make God's existence more probable than not. And if you follow the evidence where it leads and you are a rational person, then you should believe in God. And people will have varying degrees of confidence, barely more probable than not, or highly more probable than not. And as I reflect on these arguments, I mean, as a philosopher, I have to objectively weigh these arguments, consider all the objections to them that I'm aware of, and weigh them honestly. And I must say, honestly, as I come back to them again and again and again, I think to myself, these are really good arguments. They really are. They're logically valid, and it seems to me in every case the premises are more plausible than not. So I do think these are sound arguments for God's existence, and the claim is not that they establish God's existence with certainty, but simply with a good degree of probability, which is sufficient for belief and commitment to God.
You talk about God providing an objective standard for morality, but hasn't history shown that morality comes through the ruling class? It's relative to culture and society, and therefore that shows that God doesn't exist. It's just the will of the ruling class.
Okay, can you help me with the last part?
Morality coming through the ruling classes rather than being objective.
Now, if I understand the question correctly, you're raising a question of moral epistemology, not moral ontology. Even if our moral values have been inculcated into us by the ruling classes, or I think more plausibly by sociobiological evolution, that says absolutely nothing about their objective validity. To think that that would somehow call into question their objective validity is a textbook example of the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is trying to invalidate a point of view by explaining how the person came to hold it. And that's logically invalid because how you come to hold a belief says nothing concerning the truth or falsity of that belief. You could have read it in a comic book or discerned it in reading tea leaves. And how you came to hold the belief you do has no influence upon whether the belief is true or false. And so, as I say, the argument that I presented is wholly about moral ontology. It's completely open to how we come by our moral beliefs, through moral intuition, through rational reflection, through evolutionary conditioning, through social influence, through parental training. It's completely open to how we come by our moral beliefs. Maybe they come from the ruling classes, as you say. But the point would be that they are objective and grounded in reality. And if you think that they're not grounded in reality because of how they originate, then you're guilty of the genetic fallacy.
There's just one just down the front here.
How would you answer the argument that the second premise of the moral argument is just wrong, that moral objectives and moral duties simply just don't exist? For example, in the animation you showed us, it talked about how raping children is just as wrong as 2 + 2 = 5, but there are people, for example, child rapists, who would argue that that simply isn't wrong. There is nothing wrong about that.
Yes. If you ask moral realists, people who believe in objective moral values, why they do so, they will typically say it is on the basis of our moral experience. I remember in my debate with Stephen Law, an atheist, in Central Hall, Westminster, that Law said, I seem to experience objective moral values and duties. I see no reason to deny their reality, and therefore I believe in them. He had no grounding for them, but he believes in them on the basis of his moral experience. And I think that would be the majority view of moral realists. We have a moral experience in which a realm of objective moral values and duties impose themselves upon us, and we have no reason to deny their objective validity, and therefore it's perfectly rational to believe in them. As the video explained, it's very analogous to our belief in the reality of the external world on the basis of our sense perceptions. We have no way of getting outside of our sense perceptions to prove that they're veridical. You could be a brain in a vat of chemicals wired up with electrodes, being stimulated by a mad scientist to think that you're here in this auditorium at Canford listening to this lecture, when in fact none of it is real. But you'd have to be crazy to believe such a thing in the absence of any evidence for it. On the basis of your sense experience of a world of physical objects around you, You're perfectly rational to believe in the veridicality of those perceptions, unless and until you have some defeater of those perceptions. And in exactly the same way, we have, I think, moral perceptions of objective moral values and duties, and in the absence of a defeater of those, we're perfectly rational to believe that they exist. And so I would invite you to reflect on your own moral experience. Do you really think that raping a little child is a morally indifferent act? I agree with Michael Roos in the video. The man who says that raping little children is morally acceptable is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. And just as I believe that 2 + 2 = 4 with logical necessity is true, so I believe that raping little children is morally wrong with a logical necessity comparable to that mathematical truth.
There's just one just down at the front here.
How can you say that there's objective moral truth when I think even within this room there'll be people with differing views on abortion, euthanasia, death penalty, or even within different cultures, like traditionally Native American cultures who leave behind their elders because it's better for the life of the tribe if they let them die? How can you say there's objective moral truth when we differ so much in what we find moral?
This, again, I think, is an epistemological objection, not an ontological objection. To claim that there are objective moral values and duties is not to say that these are easy to discern or that they are universally held. Objective doesn't mean universal. Objective means valid and binding, independent of human opinion. But clearly, there are going to be vast areas of gray where our moral duties are not clear to us. And this requires rational reflection in order to discern our moral duty. And people can and do disagree on these issues, as you mentioned. But that doesn't mean they're not objective. And I think in many cases, there are instances of black and white where, as in the case of raping little children, it is clearly morally evil and wrong to do such a thing. And when you look at these fundamental sorts of moral principles, I think you'll find a great deal of cross-cultural agreement. These cross-cultural values may often come to expression in different ways in different cultures, but you will find that there is across humanity a broad system of common and shared values. So although epistemologically speaking, there are areas of gray, although there are people who are simply wicked and hold immoral beliefs, although moral development and change is possible, none of this goes to undermine the fact that there are objective moral values and duties that do exist.
You talk about there being one, like, God, and I was just wondering what you think of the fact that there are religions which have developed to believe in, like, more than one God, and what you think of that.
Do you mean polytheism?
Yeah.
What do I think of polytheism?
Yeah.
I think that the arguments that I've presented today exclude polytheism. These arguments narrow the field of the world's religions down to the great monotheistic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and perhaps deism. But they would exclude polytheistic religions like the religions of ancient Greece or Mesopotamia, such as you've got illustrated here in your Assyrian relief. Those gods are immanent within the universe and are finite. There is no place in these religions for a transcendent, uncreated being such as these arguments require. So I think that polytheism is incompatible with the arguments that I've presented here today, so that if these arguments are sound, they give us a transcendent personal creator and designer of the universe, rather than some sort of immanent, finite deities.
Yeah, go over here.
In your third video, it said that animals have no obligations, moral obligations to one another. And I was just going to ask, why do you think that God gave mankind morality and power over animals? I think in the Bible there's a quote that says that the fear of beasts will be upon you. Despite him being benevolent and loving all of his creation, why would he do that?
Because human beings have freedom of the will. And so far as we know, other animals do not. In order to be a moral agent who makes morally significant choices, you've got to have freedom of the will. You cannot simply act by blind instinct or causal determinants. So as far as we know, other animals do not have freedom of the will and therefore are not moral agents. And so, for example, when a wolf kills a lamb, it kills the lamb, but it doesn't murder the lamb. When a great white shark forcibly copulates with a female, it forcibly copulates with her, but it doesn't rape her, because none of these actions is morally significant for these animals. Now, if there were extraterrestrial life, which is intelligent and endowed with freedom of the will, then I would say, yes, those are moral agents as well. And that's entirely conceivable. Let me just add a word about the ethical treatment of animals. If this is right, if animals are not moral agents, then I think it's a misnomer to speak of animal rights, because only a moral agent can have moral rights. Rather, I think the basis for the ethical treatment of animals lies in our responsibility to act morally. God has given to mankind the command to steward and care for the earth. And therefore, it is immoral to treat with cruelty animals, to destroy the forests, and to pollute the oceans and skies. This is not carrying out our creation mandate of stewarding the earth. So it's not that oceans and trees have moral rights. Rather, it's that human beings have moral responsibilities to care for creation in the way that God has commanded us to do.
I think we have time probably for one more question.
Okay.
Ellen, go ahead.
Did your faith in Christianity come first, or did your study of the arguments for God's existence lead to your belief in him?
Well, obviously, in today's talk, I've tried to be very inclusive, and I've argued for a sort of generic monotheism that would be common to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. But in fact, I am a Christian theist, obviously, and if you were to ask me why, I would say it is on the basis of who the historical person Jesus of Nazareth was. Jews, Christians, and Muslims have very different views of who Jesus of Nazareth was. And when I look at these first century documents, as a historian would, it seems to me that you can show that the historical Jesus thought of himself as the long-awaited Jewish Messiah, as the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish holy men and Hebrew kings, and that he believed himself to be the divine human Son of Man prophesied by the Old Testament prophet Daniel. And it was these allegedly blasphemous claims that led to his condemnation by the Jewish high court, the Sanhedrin, and then he was delivered over to the Romans for crucifixion on the charge of treason, setting himself up as the King of the Jews. Now, whether or not you regard these claims as truly blasphemous, I think, is going to depend on what you think happened to Jesus after his death. The original disciples said that God raised him from the dead. Now, most of us today probably think that the resurrection of Jesus is just something you believe in by faith or not. But this was the study or the focus of my doctoral thesis at the University of Munich. And what I discovered, to my surprise, frankly, was that the main facts undergirding the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are actually agreed to by the wide majority of New Testament historians who have written on the historical Jesus. And these facts are three in number. First, that Jesus' tomb in which he was interred was in fact found empty by a group of his women followers on the Sunday morning after his crucifixion. Secondly, that thereafter various individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive. And thirdly, that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Now, those are the facts. The question is, how do you best explain them? And I can think of no better explanation for those facts than the one that the original disciples gave, namely, God raised him from the dead. And if that's true, then that means that the God whom Jesus had allegedly blasphemed has publicly and unequivocally vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims, and that therefore Jesus was in fact who he claimed to be. And it is on that basis then that I am a Christian theist.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Craig. Dr. Craig, it's been a huge honour. Please join me in giving him another round of applause. Dr. Craig will be hanging around after this lecture to sign some books and also to answer some questions you may have. There will be some refreshments available in the foyer area as well. Can you please be conscious that examinations are taking place next door, so just be a little bit wary of that when you leave. Thank you very much.